Hello, welcome back to Web Design for Usability. This is session 3 in which we're going to be looking at a number of tools that we can use to help us better engage with users. So the range of topics is going to be basic user research, personas, talking a little bit about personas and how we can apply them in the design process, and then a section on card sorting to help us to better understand how users think about a problem domain, relevant particularly to things like forms design and navigation design, the kinds of words and how they should be organized on the screen. Not limited just to words, of course, but that's what we end up doing with navigation design. And then we'll be finishing off this session with a very brief look at paper prototyping, which allows us to start testing with users at a very early stage of design before any code needs to be written, anything very substantial needs to be developed. We can do all that just on paper with the benefits of paper prototyping. So this is session 3, as I mentioned. If you haven't seen the introductory session, then please do have a look at that. It puts things into a little bit of perspective, but otherwise we're going to get straight on with the topics in our section on users. So user observation is by far the best tool. It's the most effective way of understanding what users really need and how they work. So this contrasts with asking people what they think, which is called self-reporting often in social research. Self-reporting is notoriously unreliable. People are always filtering the kinds of information that they give you, possibly because they don't think you're going to be interested, or possibly because they've forgotten that this is how they typically approach a particular problem. So getting into what we might call an ethnographic environment, where we're actually there with the users whilst they're trying to do the thing that we're interested in, is by far the best approach. And you might occasionally hear it referred to as ethnographic research. So before we can know what user goals we should address in our solution, we need to know who our users are and how they do what they do. That's the whole point of it. This contrasts with what was originally written back in the early 2000s about extreme programming, where to meet the needs of an agile approach, a user representative or representative user on a team. And there are all kinds of problems around that, which we're not going to go into in detail, but I am going to describe generally as we move into that particular section. It's the fact that we do need real contact with real users, and that representative users or user representatives, however we want to describe them, really aren't the same thing at all. That'll also lead us on to a discussion about personas, and personas exist for a number of good reasons. They're often very badly understood. A lot of people get confused about the purpose of personas and how they're developed and what to do with them once they do have them. And regrettably, we don't have enough time on this course to go into a large amount of detail, but you'll find that I have a separate series of sessions referred to as Guerrilla UCD, where one of those is, I've forgotten the number, but one of those is much more detailed in its coverage of personas. But I will be pointing you to an article I wrote a little while ago called Persona Stories, which explains a lot more about the background to personas and why they are so important in user-centered design. So the point of personas is that we need to design for small, coherent sets of users. Basically, we need to have focus, and personas help us to achieve that while making it possible for team members to more readily identify and empathize with real users. It's very hard to think about users as being people when we keep talking about them as users, this collective noun which means many things to many different people. We end up with infinitely elastic users, for example, one that you believe is capable of certain operations and characteristics, and I might believe something completely different about the same individual. So being very clear, going out doing user research and encapsulating that user research into a persona or a collection of personas is by far the best way of dealing with that whole collection of problems that we otherwise end up with. The issue with extreme programming and other agile approaches which try to represent the needs of users within the team uh, are that the users themselves, the people that we're incorporating into the team, are almost certainly chosen for the wrong reasons. They may be problem domain experts. Certainly the very first extreme programming project, which was a payroll system for Chrysler, called C cubed, I think, Chrysler Comprehensive Compensation System. The representative user was somebody who knew all about payroll from a user's perspective. She was a real problem domain expert. There is, in fact, in the book Extreme Programming Refactored, I think it's called, a section about the fact that this representative user became almost burned out, that she almost had a nervous breakdown in the process of the project, that so much stress was placed on her. And there are all kinds of drawbacks aside from mental collapse that we have to worry about. And of course, there are other reasons that people get incorporated into the project team. They might be very popular, or they might be very unpopular with their colleagues, depending on the criteria used to select them. You know, it might be nice to get this person out of the office, that kind of thing. They might be popular or unpopular with management, and that might be how they ended up on the team. They may be the most technically competent, but of course, what does that do for our typical user? You know, we have someone who is actually a very technically competent user on the design team, then aren't we inclined to end up with solutions which assume a degree of competence which isn't realistic in terms of average users, and certainly users who are new to the system? Or they might just be, you know, if we're taking real shortcuts here, they might just be geographically well placed to become part of the development team. They might just be in the right part of town or in the right building. The bottom line is that they're really almost never typical users. That almost doesn't happen. The person on the design team is actually just your average user who understands some parts of the system but not others, and really just wants to be given good guidance on how to get their jobs done. So that's one of the main problems we have with that whole approach. Now, even if they were typical users at the outset, they soon wouldn't be, but just after a few weeks they'd be too familiar with the technical aspects of the project. They would already have a vested interest in the solutions chosen, and because of this thing called internal consistency, if you've been part of a discussion and an agreement to do things one way, you're very unlikely to criticize yourself a week or two later because it turns out that that isn't perhaps the best solution for less experienced colleagues. And of course, there is the real worry that you may have forgotten what it's like to be sitting alone in a remote location with no one to help you to figure out how to get this particular task done. And certainly I've come across real world instances of all these things. Also, the number of personas and the range of user experience cannot be realistically typified by a small number of representative users. So if your overall goal is to actually incorporate users into the design team, and they are to be your only contact with real users, it's really not a realistic goal. It's just not something you're going to be able to do. So what we need to do instead is to go out and do research with real users. That means we need to recruit real potential users. We need to talk to them about the goals that they have in this problem domain, what kind of things they do, the things that they work with, called artifacts, and also the environment in which they do them. If we're designing systems for the typical office environment, we all have something of an understanding about what that's like. If you work in a nicely enclosed, quiet office, however, that is quite different from working in a vastly open, noisy call center or other open plan office. So even office situations can be very different. But if you imagine working in an unheated warehouse, your approach to solving certain problems needs to be different. I've even seen videos of computerized systems that have to work in milking sheds in a farm, and they have to be steam cleanable. So you can't have a traditional keyboard. You have to have a membrane keyboard, and you have to be able to clean that on a twice daily basis. So there are all kinds of challenges there to do with the context of use as well as the users themselves. When we're doing user observations, we primarily take notes. That certainly is my favorite mode of operation. We also would take photocopies or photographs of things that users are working with. And we might consider certainly audio recordings if we wanted to make sure that we've captured all the nuances of our discussions at a later stage. It is possible to do video recordings too. Obviously, in both cases, you need the permission of the people involved. But I should just warn you that making video recordings during interviews has a couple of issues, one of which is that it's very hard to persuade people that they are going to be treated anonymously when you're videoing them from the front. So that's one issue straight away. The other is that people often do get nervous and they do behave differently when they're being video recorded, typically. Audio recording, not such a big deal. Video recording can change things noticeably for some people. And obviously you need, as I mentioned already, permissions for the recording and also permissions for screenshots and photographs and so forth. Sometimes it isn't possible to do user observation. It really is the best if you can. Focus groups and interviews are very much second-rate approaches, but they're still better than nothing, still better than, say, for example, an online questionnaire. So we do these things. I've certainly done them as part of user research on a fairly regular basis, but I do much prefer to actually watch users doing the tasks that I'm interested in researching. So we do have interviews. If you are going to try to make use of interviews instead of observation, then try to make it as much like the real scenario as possible, so that you actually can walk users through the tasks or the goals that they have to perform. So you try to make it as much like an observation as you can, even though it's an artificial setting. And you will discover that people will remember things that they wouldn't have told you in an interview because they're going through the steps, and that's one of the key benefits. So if, for example, you are faced with having to do user research at a conference, a user conference for your product or services, then that might be the best approach, just to set up a little mock-up scenario that allows them to believe that they're actually doing this thing. So try to provide as similar a working environment as possible. Focus groups, well, in general, this issue of self-reporting I mentioned, people describe what they should do rather than what they actually do, and I've had numerous examples of that where we've hauled somebody into a usability lab or a market research studio with an observation room, and of course people will, under those circumstances, typically tell you what their job is rather than how they do it. So that can be a serious factor when it comes to trying to solve the real problems as opposed to the theoretical problems that they might be having. They do omit important detail, especially where they don't even remember that they do this thing. I've actually sat with users and say, a little while ago you did this, why did you do that? And they didn't remember doing it, they didn't remember why they had to do it. And when we went back and looked again at the process, they say, oh yeah, that's because this system never did that correctly. At this point we have to go off and do something else with this other system so that we can get around this hiccup that's been there for years. So you'll find out things like that in the process. Often they provide too much detail, obscuring larger issues. Sometimes they're reluctant to raise unpopular issues, something which might be a little bit of a sore point. Sometimes they want to really get stuck into the sore points. They want to promote controversy because they don't agree with the way that things are done or how the organization works. Sometimes you can find yourself caught up with political issues without even realizing it. Some users or participants, I should say, overgeneralize, so they really find it hard to get into the detail without actually doing the work that we're interested in. Or sometimes the opposite is true, that they focus far too narrowly on individual specific issues raised by the interviewer's questions, and then you never get to see the big picture. In focus groups, you have even more factors that come into play. We have group dynamics, and sometimes I'm really amazed, having given people questionnaires prior to a focus group session, and then compared the results of the questionnaires to what was discussed in the session, and you have a very hard time believing that they were actually the same people, because the dynamics in the focus group can change things quite considerably. So just to reiterate that by far, actual observation of users doing the thing that you're interested in is the best way of doing research for most purposes, unless you have very specific questions that you need to answer. Interviews, well, if you've been able to provide a similar working environment, then try to treat it as much as possible as an observation session. And as I mentioned already, walking through a process step at a time is by far the best way of dealing with that. Have relevant artifacts to hand, so make it seem as real as you can, and encourage users to include all detail, no matter how trivial they might think it is. You can end up with people who focus far too much on the detail, and sometimes you have to get them politely to raise the general level of discussion, but the management of those situations does vary from participant to participant. Avoid interrupting the walkthrough, so don't ask questions every time they occur. I think I would make a list of questions, or I often make a list of questions and go back at the end of the session or at the break in the process and say, you did this, why was that, or what was the reasoning behind that, why is that a problem, or how has that come to be the favored solution. Ask about good and bad features of the current process at the end of the session, and do ask users about what they would change and how they would keep what they would keep the same, and talk about why that is, and what works, what doesn't work, all the same kinds of issues there.